It's Mountain Monday, and you know what to do. Breathe in. And out. And breathe in. And out. And this weekend was actually a pretty sane weekend on Twitter. What? How is this possible? This must be an act of God. The only off the hook people I had to deal with were some rabid Game of Thrones fans that took rather personally my comments that Forgotten Realms was better than Game of Thrones. And I basically wrote a whole blog post on leannakirsner.com about how Game of Thrones borrows some traditions from The Lord of the Rings without some underpinnings that makes the whole thing kind of come apart because there's nothing holding it together. And, you know, you get those book nerds who are like, rah, 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 rah. And the issue with Game of Thrones right now is it's this unique split from A Song of Ice and Fire, isn't it? Because it's one of the few instances, the only other one we can really compare this to is the later Harry Potter films, where they had to go into production before the books were finished. But Game of Thrones actually has to proceed when, is it the fourth book? I think so. Of A Song of Ice and Fire is not finished. So it's almost like we have to take the stuff that's going on in Game of Thrones now as a completely separate thing from A Song of Ice and Fire. And that's a very interesting adapted work. And so I had the tricky thing of having to compare and contrast the book of The Lord of the Rings, which was the inspiration for A Song of Ice and Fire, because the films weren't yet made, with the HBO show Game of Thrones, which is the TV property, not the books, because it's the TV property based on the books themselves. But there's certain things that are going on in the TV show now that have not happened in the books. But Game of Thrones fans are rabid. And these are the sorts of situations where, you know, as a content creator, as somebody who has to handle a lot of criticism, it really brings the point home of the thing I've been saying about game developers of there's the types of criticism you listen to and the types of criticism you brush off. And I did edit the post out because of a marijuana joke. There's no hard evidence that J.R.R. Tolkien smoked weed, but there's a lot of hints at it. There is no evidence. It was a joke, so I took that part out of the post because some people were getting hung up on it, and I thought, this is not the main point of the piece. I am taking it out because it is a distraction. I am not changing things that are my core argument because I stand by it. I don't believe that Game of Thrones is as good as people claim it is. And that's just my opinion. But I think it chugs along based on some very charismatic actors and some beautiful costume designs and set designs. And I think that it really masks some emptiness, some holes in the core work as a TV property. But that's just my opinion, right? It doesn't matter. But I'm not going to change that opinion because some people got mad at me. And this is very important when we look at game design and this tricky thing about censorship, self-censorship, and bowing to public opinion. It is every content creator's personal choice to decide what to correct based on feedback and what stuff to keep. And there's no 100% clear right or wrong answer to that. But there are things that are better than others. You can't just change everything every time you get a piece of feedback. You can't. because you lose the soul of what you're doing. And that's why it's so important to sort of have a theme, a reason you're writing that is clear and defined to you. And you can always go back to that of, why am I doing this? What am I trying to accomplish? And you can change things that you feel take away from that, but you keep things that are part of that. And the thing I wanted to talk about is, replicating things without entirely understanding the core of why it was done. And when you get that deep in something that some people really, really like, people are going to get angry. And that's not a reason to change. And I think too many people, because they're so worried about, oh my God, people aren't going to buy my stuff, it's going to be unpopular, oh my God, that they cave too soon. And they dilute the core of what makes their thing good. And there's a lot of that going on in video games because of the fear that, having to sell 7 million copies of something to make it profitable, that's daunting. The numbers keep going up year to year. It used to be 1 million was awesome. Then it was 3 million. Then the target was 5. It's creeping up to 7 now because these games, AAA games, are so expensive. And they don't even cover the cost of the game because of the graphics and because of the art and because of the army of artists that are required to make these things. And Ollie Barter, who you saw interviewed on Dialogue Options, wrote an article in Forbes about the emergence of the quadruple A game. And he didn't name any games, but I personally think that Destiny is the first quadruple A game. In that it was so expensive to produce and it need to make these monster sales. I mean, the only other games I would sort of lump in with that are games like Grand Theft Auto 5 that, again, massive budget, monster sales, right? Things like that. You could even lump in The Sims, although I'm not personally, I don't have the development budget in my head. I don't know how that cost to make, but it sold gargantuan amounts. These games are in a league of their own. They are. Other games cannot compete with them, and they shouldn't try. And there's I don't want to say an emptiness, but there is a sort of, they're both essentially sort of, they have that open world experience. You could almost lump something like Skyrim in that it's this massive game that sold a bazillion gajillion copies. Although I don't think Skyrim quite approached. I could be wrong. I don't think Skyrim quite approached what Grand Theft Auto or Destiny did. But these games are in a league of their own, and I don't think that developers with more modest budgets and that are trying to tell a less sort of sprawling, and it's not even tell a story, provide a less sprawling experience. I don't think they should attempt to compete with these games. I think they should develop their product and tell their story in their way, the same way I am. And I'm a big believer in not pleasing everybody. I am not a people pleaser. God, I'd be a wreck if I was. And it's amazing to me the number of people who tell me I'm too concerned about what other people think. And when someone says that to me, I really start questioning their judgment, because I think that's more of a reflection on them, what they think they would be doing in my shoes. Because my God, if I was a people pleaser, I would be conducting myself in a very different way. Now, I will say that when you don't have a natural other-oriented inclination, when you are self-oriented, and that doesn't mean selfish, it just means that you sort of draw your opinions from, you draw your opinions internally as opposed to going around and asking a bunch of people advice before you make a decision. I make a decision on my own. But it is scary sometimes, and it is very isolating, and I wish I wasn't. It really pisses me off that people are exceptionally judgmental of people like me who sort of have their story to tell and have their reason for being and are prepared to sort of deal with the consequences of an unpopular opinion. Now, that doesn't mean we agree with the consequences of an unpopular opinion. We just accept that they're there. And we're not going to pretend that the system is fair. And we're not going to pretend that it's somehow a surprise to us that having an unpopular opinion has consequences. But I see so many people who complain about the fact that a controversial opinion is unpopular. I mean, of course it is. Any opinion that makes people think in the slightest is unpopular. And that's just the nature of creating challenging content, but you got to do it. I mean, it's funny. I had a lot of people come at me. Well, not a lot of people, but more than I expected, come at me on that odd little post that did surprisingly well. I did about that picture that Destructoid used to say PAX East was starting, that I said, this is a problem with sexism in the video game industry, is that a bunch of guys can cosplay in ill-fitting underwear with accessories, and that's okay. That's all well and good. That's fun. And Jessica Negri gets thrown out of PAX for a costume where she's fully covered. It just showed a lot of torso. And people argued the double standard. Like, they argued that it wasn't a double standard in some fairly bizarre ways. That it was okay for these guys to run around in their underwear in a public building because they weren't being paid to do it, and she was, and so that's bad. That makes no sense. Decency is decency. It doesn't matter if you're being paid or not. It's got to be the same standard for everyone. If it's appropriate for an attendee to wear something, I don't see why it's a problem that someone's being paid to take it to the next level and look polished and good and represent a character. I don't understand that double standard. I also don't understand the argument that it was somehow okay because Destructoid swiped the photo from a convention in Los Angeles to talk about PAX. It doesn't matter. The point, the salient point, is that it is somehow okay for a bunch of dudes to run around in literal underwear, even though it's so ill-fitting that when they sort of lunge to the side, it's gaping in the point that you can almost see their testicles. But a woman who is clearly gorgeous has put time and effort, and even if somebody else made the costumes, it doesn't matter. She put the time and the effort into the fittings and making sure the wig was on right and the makeup was done properly and making sure that costume was put on to a degree of polish that makes the character come alive. That is somehow less decent than a bunch of dudes running around in ill-fitting underwear. I do not buy that. And it doesn't matter how many people argue me on it and how many people make straw man arguments. I am not going to change my opinion on that. And I respect any creative, it doesn't matter what field they're in, that has that ability to accept all criticism as something people have the right to do, as long as it's not, personal attacks and swearing at you and calling you evil, because that's silly to think someone's evil because of a piece of entertainment. But people have the right to have whatever opinion they want. I'm not going to necessarily act on every piece of criticism. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to act on every piece of criticism as well. Some people have a good point. And I think that the sweet spot for a creative is to be open and resilient enough to accept the criticism that makes sense when you go, okay, I see the point. And to not get too thrown off by the stuff that is coming out of left field and you're like, what? Like, somebody freaked out and because I accidentally misspelled Tyrion Lannister because I was in a rush, then that means I know nothing about Game of Thrones. That's ridiculous. That was just a cheap shot. People have got to understand that when you're juggling so many fantasy properties, and it was one of those funny things that I always misspell Cersei Lannister because it's spelled Cersei Lannister instead of the Greek version Circe, which a professor in university insisted is Kirke. But but the root is obviously there. So I always am super cautious of that name. And what's her name? Khaleesi, because I always confuse that with Khajiit terms from the Elder Scrolls. But I'm so aware of those names that I miss something else. And it was just a typo. But some people like to isolate those little things like, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, obviously that's nonsense, right? Obviously that's complete nonsense. And coming at a work as complicated as some of these epic fantasy pieces, it's so reductive to dismiss someone on those points. And if someone is willing to do that, then I don't take their criticism seriously. Other things I listen to more. And that's the process of evolving, and that's the process of learning, and that's the process of being open to the people who consume your content. And I think that's great. I know there are some people that believe that creatives shouldn't change for anything. And I am not part of that camp. I think a good creative listens to the people who are interested in their content and learns from that relationship. I don't think it should be one way. I think you should always have a relationship with your fan base or consumer base or you know, your community. That's the word I'm looking for, because I don't consider it a fan base and I don't consider it a consumer base. It's something more than that. It's more two-way. It's more interactive. And I think it's very important to be open to that. I think it's important to hear what people are saying, but you don't always have to agree, because the world is very boring when everyone agrees. And so that's sort of the message for today, and that's sort of the point of Zen, that, you know, I think that the middle way, the good, you know, the noble middle way, is to act on some criticism, but not all of it. And that sounds so simple, but in practice, man, it can be challenging sometimes. But that's Mountain Monday for the day. I am speaking at the Ottawa International Games Conference today. I will have a report sometime this week on how that went, maybe tomorrow. But in the meantime, we're going to close off, so breathe in. And out. And breathe in. And out.